Hi, I'm Brenda Dozier, the Crop Training Coordinator, and today I'm going to explain the yield exclusion option. We had talked about the yield exclusion option in our December training, but RMA, the Risk Management Agency, had not given the details of the crops and counties and years eligible yet. But that was then announced in January, and we sent out an email on January 19th. And in that email, we included the crops and counties and eligible years and an instructional video on how to run a list of the policies that each of you have that are eligible for the yield exclusion option. So those tables that were included were determined by RMA, and that determination was made by using the criteria of the year eligible would be when the county average is at least 50% below the previous 10-year average, and those would be considered primary counties. Then any contiguous county to those primaries would also be on the eligible list. So as you can see, this is just a portion of the table we sent out starting in alphabetical order. So Adams corn is eligible for 2012, and that was a primary county, while Alexander, the next one on the list, 2012 corn is eligible, but because of contiguous, which is why the C is listed. So please refer to those tables to see the full list of all the years eligible. There are some counties where more than 1 year is even eligible for the yield exclusion. The other element that was in that email was an instructional video on how to run the list for your policies that are eligible. And it's a data download feature, and what I've got here is an example of the list that's then provided. It gives you the policy number and your insured's name, and then specifically tells you which county, crop, and what unit number has an eligible year in it. So my example here of Joe Farmer, corn unit 2000, the 2012 year is eligible. Or the last one on Joe Farmer's list, Will County corn unit 600, 2005 is an eligible year. So if you haven't already run your listing, please do so because it makes your job easier. It tells you which of your customers are eligible for the yield exclusion. So here's an example. If the first one on my list is this APH, yield exclusion works like this. It has nothing to do with the farmer's actual yields. It's just that the year determined by RMA is on the list. So on the left here, we have the APH before the yield exclusion. So we have the 10-year average here, and that's 151 bushels. This happens to be a county where 2012 is eligible for exclusion, and that means you leave it out of your average. Therefore, in this example, a 9-year average is 160. If this customer chose the yield exclusion, his APH would go from a 151 all the way up to a 160, and now his guarantee would be based on a 160 APH rather than the 151. A second example here on the left, this is the next unit eligible for this policyholder, and this unit only has 5 years of corn history. You see that it was on a rotation basis, that every other year it was obviously beans in this example. And again, 2012 is a year that's eligible for exclusion. Well, in this scenario, instead of getting a 147 average, this policyholder chose the yield exclusion, and now they would simply get a 4-year average, and that bumps it all the way up to a 166. So you can see this yield exclusion option can really change a policyholder's APH, and in turn will increase their guarantees because of the APH now after using the yield exclusion option. So as we told in December training, yield exclusion, the YE option, has to be selected by the sales closing deadline, and it is on a crop by county basis, and you simply indicate on the change form that they want the YE. This is a continuous election and will remain in effect until canceled. So after you have a customer who wants it, then you'll need to key that then on the crop web. And this is just the example to show how to do it. Under the options drop-down, yield exclusion is a choice. Click that box and then submit the change, and then you will see that then the YE has been added to the coverage record on the crop web. All right, my next slide here talks about how an APH combines or can have multiple options. And in my example here is a Livingston County corn where there is yield exclusion eligible and as well as trend adjustment available. So I want to show how each of these options changes a producer's APH. First of all, we must know the actual yields. So this customer's 10-year average is 168. If he was just interested in looking at the yield exclusion option only, and Livingston County corn 2012 is eligible for exclusion, so if I was looking at just the yield exclusion only, I would use the remaining 9 yields, and that average would be 174. This customer also is interested in the trend-adjusted option. Well, then we could have trend-adjusted either with YE or without YE. So we would need to do the calculations there. So we have trend adjustment without yield exclusion gives us these yields for an average of 178. But if the customer wanted to include trend and yield exclusion, we would be looking at leaving out the 12 and then our average of the other 9 all the way up to 184. Again, the true APH was 168, but look with the options of trend and yield exclusion gets a producer's APH all the way up to 184 in this example. Now taking that one step further in how to then quote these options, on the Profit Pro, again, remember that we would select the options that we want to quote, so trend adjustment and yield exclusion. And then most importantly is then to fill in the yield boxes with the appropriate yields. I'm going to start over here on the top right called the rate yield box. It is always the yield before any adjustments. It's their actual APH. So if you'll remember from that previous slide, his 10-year average was 168. Okay. Now to move over to the top left, this box is titled Approved Yield Without TA. Well, the number that goes in this box is their yield without TA, but it does include yield adjustment, if applicable, and yield exclusion, if applicable. remember on that previous slide that, yes, we had yield exclusion eligible, and that 9-year average was 174. That would be the number we'd put up here in approved yield without TA. And you'll notice I have this blue arrow going back and forth between the top left and the bottom right, because these always should match with the exception of cups or floors, but in my example here there's no cups or floors, so I would put the 174 also in this adjusted yield box down here on the lower right. Then the last box to fill in on the quote on Profit Pro is the approved yield with TA, and my description here shows that this is the APH yield with all the adjustments, whether there's trend adjustment, yield adjustment, yield exclusion. And again, back to my previous slide, that answer with all the adjustments included is 184. That's the very most important thing to get an accurate quote on Profit Pro, is that we have these 4 yield boxes filled in with the appropriate yields for a particular unit. When yield exclusion is chosen by the sales closing deadline, the rules state that it applies to all actual yields in the crop years eligible unless the insured notifies us, meaning country here, in writing by the production reporting date of any actual yields they choose to retain. So, if you have a customer who has a unit that has an eligible year and they do not want to exclude it, they want to retain it in their APH, then that is considered an opt-out. They're opting out of yield exclusion on a particular yield in a particular APH database. And if that is the case, they have to sign the APH database where they want to retain the yield. So my next slide here shows this happens to be Joe Farmer's policy, and this, I've got an example of 2 of his APHs, this first one and this second one. Both of them are eligible for the yield exclusion in the 2012 year. You'll notice he chose the yield exclusion by the sales closing deadline, and therefore the 2012 is left out of his average on both of these databases. But this particular policyholder does not want this 155 removed. He wants to retain it. So if you want to retain a yield that is on the exclusion list, you have to mark the opt-out box, as I've done here, and sign this APH by the production reporting deadline, which is April 29th. While this APH, he wants this 124 excluded, so he would not mark the opt-out box and therefore would not sign that APH. Then the last step you would have to do when a customer chose the opt-out is to key that on the APH on the crop web, and that is simply done by checking the opt-out box. And when you check that box, then you'll notice it puts that year back in the column to be used for the customer's APH. That concludes the explanation of yield exclusion option. If you have any questions, please feel free to call Crop Underwriting at toll-free 877-274-9800. Thank you.